this is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast. Today, we are offering 5 conversations from episode 27, our preview of key sessions and abstracts at next week's EASL Congress 2023, plus a 6th separate conversation with Arun Sanyal and David Kleiner on the benefits of AI-assisted histopathology in anticipation of a major prospective study on the topic. This is the first of 2 conversations stemming from my dialogue with Louise Campbell about posters and abstracts she found interesting. She actually identified 3. The first, on Thursday afternoon, focuses on causes of death for patients with different fibrosis levels at the time they decease. Not surprisingly, what the authors termed liver-related disease, which included hepatocellular carcinoma, accounts for well over half the causes of death for F4 patients. Slightly more interesting, for patients at each level from F0 through F3, cardiovascular diseases and extrahepatic cancers accounted for more deaths than the entire range of liver-related disease. This appears to confirm a point we make on this podcast frequently. The liver, which Stephen Harrison describes as the canary in the coal mine, signals many different kinds of diseases, including all those related to diabetes, heart, kidney, etc., and the various types of extrahepatic cancers linked to obesity, or, as we sometimes call them on the podcast, obesogenic cancers. The second poster Louise wishes to discuss comes from Cyrielle Caussy's group in Lyon and is titled Systematic Screening for NAFLD-related Advanced Fibrosis in High-Risk Population Diabetology Using Transient Elastography, Prospective Study. Fundamentally, the study uses VCTE and non-invasive tests to screen for advanced fibrosis and measure the accuracy of results. Tests perform extremely well in terms of negative prediction, but not as well in positive prediction, especially in patients under age 60. With major drug development presentations led by the Maestro NASH results, new material on diagnostics from Litmus, Nail NIT, and others, and the nomenclature presentation, the EASL Congress will be 3 very packed days. We will be reporting twice on Saturday, once before the Saturday session and once afterwards, and I may attempt to post some one-on-one interviews on Thursday and Friday. So, when listening to this episode, think about what you want to attend in person or virtually, and just sit back, listen, enjoy, learn. When you're done, join the dialogue in our LinkedIn discussion group. So we're going to take the next bit of time and talk about a couple, 3 abstracts that you find particularly interesting and that you will be able to hopefully talk about when we do episodes. Where shall we go first?
Well, I think I'm going for a poster presentation to start with, and it's on the Thursday, and it's 414, and it's by Ying Shang, who's presenting it, and the group, and it's Causes of Death by Fibrosis in 959 biopsy-proven NAFLD patients. Sterling title.
By the way, that Hannes is one of the people who will be joining us over the weekend, and this is obviously his group.
Well, he's got a number of abstracts in from my flick through the book.
Yeah, they publish a bunch of stuff, that unit.
Louise Campbell.
To be fair, I thought this was an interesting article for a couple of reasons, and ultimately the backgrounds and aims of it were the causes of death in patients with NAFLD that may differ on the fibrosis stage at diagnosis. So they wanted to aim to assess the distribution of different causes of death through the group, but they were all biopsy proven, which is obviously the gold standard that we need at the current moment in time. So they conducted a retrospective analysis of 959 biopsy-proven patients from 3 university hospitals in Sweden between 1974 and 2020, and the causes of death were ICD-10 coded from the Swedish Causes of Death Register until the end of 2021. So liver-related deaths were defined as hepatocellular carcinoma, cirrhosis, decompensating cirrhosis, and liver failure. So the results of that, among the 959 patients, the mean age was 49.5 years, 61.7% were male, but 335, which was 34.9% of the cohort, died during the median follow-up of 17.9 years. So it was a long study. Mean age of death was 74.6 years, and 52.7% were male. And of those, 75 patients had 0 fibrosis, 120, which was 32.4, had F1, 32.7% F2, and 45% of patients were F3, with another 47% of F4, and the died of...
Is that Louise, is that percent of population, or is that the percentage of patients at that fibrosis level who died?
I think it's that fibrosis level is the way I read it when it says the mean age of death.
I guess my thought is I'm looking at these numbers, and I got 5 numbers that add up to a couple of 100%.
Well, I was looking at that at the same time, so I think it's 26, and patients, for example, in F4...
And that the cohort would wind up being 53 or 54 patients that they were observing preserving an F4. Okay, got it. Okay, good.
And I think that's the way it's meant to, because yes, when you add up those numbers, it's certainly not 100%. So when I was looking through this piece, what struck me at the end was something we talk about here a lot, is that the conclusion in the ultimate study was that patients in NAFLD and cirrhosis at diagnosis, liver disease is the most common causes of death, which is what we've discussed in the past, that where you look at liver disease is the cause. But in patients with no or non-cirrhotic fibrosis, that cardiovascular and extrahepatic cancers were the biggest cause of death. So different management strategies need to be employed, was their conclusion for that. The reason I was interested in that, we discuss it here a lot, that do we look for purely liver-related outcomes and liver disease, or do we start to stratify NAFLD by the metabolic cardiovascular risks rather than just the NAFLD and liver that we look for? The evidence that this was coming out with sort of strengthened my views. And so
I get that, and I had the same reaction. It's interesting that they put HCC in with other liver-related causes of death. So at first, when I first looked at this, my reaction was, well, gee, where's liver cancer in here? And then I realized, but what about, I'm eyeballing here about 55% of the F4. Now, you're not dealing with large populations, but F4 is significantly more likely to have had liver-related cause of death than anybody else. Once you get past that, I'm not sure those other differences are significant.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think it's this, if we just screen for liver damage and liver disease, that yes, we're going to find liver-related mortality in that population more so. But actually it broadens that whole question of who are we looking for when we look for poor liver health. Because in this study, it is those that didn't have cirrhotic NASH, people we would discharge back to primary care, ultimately, if we were just looking for liver disease, actually had higher rates of death in other areas. That, again, we discuss an awful lot about this cardiometabolic link to type 2 diabetes, non-hepatic cancers, and cardiovascular disease. So I think it's liver health for me, it's liver health, and this is a screen and some evidence that liver health counts as just as much as liver disease.
Well, probably more, actually. If you take a look, there are slight increases in the liver-related deaths, but you're at under 20% for F3 and downward from there. Interestingly enough, F0, F1, you have other as a significant cause of death as well. But that's not surprising. All right, so that makes good sense. I'd love to know what else they know about these patients that they'll be able to tell us in the presentation, but I like this. This is interesting.
I'd like to, obviously, have been able to see non-invasive technologies used to assess FIB4 and things like that to see how they screen, but these were all biopsy-proven patients. They've got a great data set and cohort in Sweden, and Hannes does some great work.
Hannes does fantastic work. What other poster or paper would you like to cover? Just before we do that real quickly, for those who are looking, that could be found on page, I guess it's 631 of the abstract book. So if you want to scan for that, THU14 found on page 631. So which other are you looking for and which page can we find it on?
Yeah, my next presentation that I chose was THU, which is Thursday, and it's 410, and it can be located on page 629 of the abstract book, or S603 on the bottom corner. And it was a systematic screening of NAFLD-related advanced fibrosis high-risk population in diabetology using transient elastography, a prospective study. And this is being presented by Cyrielle Caussy. She's obviously been on the podcast, and her strength and the team's strength is the diabetes. So the background aims of this was the systematic screening of NAFLD-related advanced fibrosis currently recommended in high-risk populations such as patients with type 2 diabetes and or obesity, although there are limited prospective data from patients enrolled and systematically assessed using transient elastography and diabetology. So they aim to examine the utility of non-invasive tests and the prevalence of advanced fibrosis in this prospective cohort in the diabetes. So it was a multi-centre prospective study, NAFLD care, including patients with type 2 diabetes and or obesity, average age between 40 and 80 years, BMI of less than 40, enrolled in a systematic screening, advanced fibrosis in 4 diabetology centres in France between October 2020 and November 2022. So all patients had a standardised research visit, fasting labs, including fibro test, liver assessment by FibroScan, and all other causes of liver disease were systematically excluded. The presence of advanced fibrosis was determined after the assessment in hepatology with either the histological fibrosis stage of greater than 3 or equal to 3, or overt imaging diagnosis of cirrhosis, or concordant transient elastography of greater than 8 kilopascals, and a fibro test of greater than F3 according to the EASL guidelines. So of the 487 patients screened, 461 met the eligibility. Mean age was 59.5 years. BMI was 32.7. 46% were females. 75.5% had obesity, and 87.4% had type 2 diabetes. diabetes. So 72% had dyslipidemia, 67% hypertension, and among them 55.5% had a FIB4 of less than 1.3. And the proportion of patients with transient elastography of equal to or greater than 8 and equal to or greater than 12 was 18 and 4.8 respectively in those groups. So they ruled in and ruled out advanced fibrosis in 71.4% of participants based on the transient elastography of less than 8 and a fibre test of less than F3 in these diabetic patients. So I think as they went through, they looked at 82 participants had determined status of advanced fibrosis, 27% confirmed diagnosis with advanced fibrosis, and 54 undetermined status of advanced fibrosis due to discordant non-invasive technologies, which can happen, and no liver biopsy results. So advanced fibrosis for 6.6% of the participants, and a higher BMI was significantly associated with an increased odds ratio of 1,114 with a 95% confidence interval, 101 to 1.24. But adjusted for age and sex, FIB4 of less than 1.3 had a high negative predictive value, which we would expect, of 98%, and among participants with advanced fibrosis, 15% had false negatives. The conclusion of the study, the estimated prevalence of advanced fibrosis in this multi-centre study in high-risk populations was 6.6%, as we've just said there. But what they were able to do was the high negative predictive value of advanced fibrosis, but this significantly misclassified. A FIB4 of less than 1.3 had a very high negative predictive value for ruling out AF, but significantly misclassified patients younger than 60 years of age. So that age range coming into changing the outcomes of these patients and missing them. So further analysis in a larger population is key, and I think this study, it was about trying to get the right patients. We've all looked at FIB4 and looked at different age groups and where it has weaknesses, and particularly in younger ages, but this inability to look at the false negatives, I suppose, in that group. We are doing better than we were before by using it. So the conclusion was all about FIB4, not necessarily about transient elastography.
The thing I'm struck by in the abstract is not just the cut age of 60, but the mean age for the participants with the negative predictive values versus those with correct positive prediction was 51 versus 66.6, which is really quite a difference. So they set it at 60, but it feels like the younger you get, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out why that is. I mean, well, I guess, we know Cyrielle, so we can ask her. But my snap reaction is that FIB4, as Stephen and Mazen have both talked about in different episodes, FIB4 performs worse when you're dealing with highly enriched populations, because it does not do a very good job on positives, right? So you're seeing that again here, high false negative rate. But this is not particularly, doesn't feel like an enriched population per se.
It's our low-hanging fruit, isn't it? So it had a great ability to rule out patients, and I think that's the really good thing for me. We don't want to get lots of people in the wrong category. So its ability to be a predictor of who wasn't going to have it was great, irrespective of the weakness.
I guess that's right. And missing 15% of those people, as they point out, 15% at this point comes out to be an N of 4. So that's interesting, because I think that ultimately the challenge around FIB4 is how well does it do as a first-line screener, where the challenge is entirely around false negatives. We know it's very good at negative prediction. The question is how many false negatives are we going to get, because those are people that we wish we were treating. And is there any way to figure out who they are? This obviously doesn't get to the second question, but the question, I guess, is 15% false negative an acceptable rate?
I suppose the question for me is, if we were to look at the AGA guidelines and that, we'd be looking at an indeterminate group of above 1.3 and below 2.67 who should have the FibroScans. And I know they did FibroScans, so I'd like to have seen that more granular breakdown of the FIB4 and how it functioned in the diabetology population in those categories that we use. But that's not evident here.
That's a great point. And then the only comment about that is that when you got an N of 4 that are false negatives at 1.6, if you cut it at 1.3 and then at 2.67, you're going to have, what, 2 on one side, 2 on the other side, 1 on one side, 3 on the other side. Sample's probably a little small to support that level of analysis. It's absolutely the right question. Red, yellow, green works a lot better than red, green on this kind of thing.
And that was an outcome, wasn't it? It was a bigger study should be done with a bigger population, and hopefully that's what the team are doing, and probably people around the world are doing that in different countries for their diabetes populations. Low-hanging fruit, as Stephen calls them.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. We hope to be back early or middle next week with a preview of the ADA convention in San Diego. We will clearly be back next weekend with a bunch of coverage at the EASL event itself. So until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.